We want to bring in Niall Stanage, White House columnist with our partner, thehill.com. Niall, thanks for joining us tonight.
Good to be with you, Natasha.
We just heard what Oregon's Attorney General said about this latest move by the administration to get Guard troops into Oregon. So, Niall, how does this work? I mean, Oregon and California looking at this legal action, but meanwhile, the Oregon governor says 100 California troops are already on the ground in that state. Can these legal actions prevent hundreds more from pouring in?
Well, that, of course, is the $64,000 question, because this whole move in relation to California is plainly intended by the Trump administration as an end run around the judge's ruling that put a pause on the Oregon National Guard being used by President Trump in the manner that he wanted. Having received that adverse ruling from a judge that President Trump himself nominated, we should add, the administration is now seeking to utilize National Guard troops from California. Obviously, they are subject to the challenge that the Oregon Attorney General just outlined there, and it will be for a court to decide. But as you say, will it be a moot point if there are troops already on their way?
And you published an article today on thehill.com about how some of the president's most recent moves are pushing the boundaries of his power. It has critics concerned. How does Trump's National Guard orders play into those fears?
Because, quite simply, it is suspected as him lowering the bar to deploy the military on the streets in a domestic law enforcement role. There's a law that typically prevents that, the Posse Comitatus Act. But the point is that there is a fear that this president, who is uncommonly willing to use the levers of government power purely for his own advantage, is lowering the bar required to put troops on the streets against American citizens.
And the article also goes into how the government shutdown relates to this expanded use of his powers. What specifically has happened so far during the shutdown to boost those concerns?
So for a start, we have the promise or threat from President Trump to lay off federal workers rather than furlough them, as has happened in previous shutdowns. But we've also seen funding paused for both New York City and Chicago, infrastructure projects that federal money was to be used for. The purse strings are now being tightened. President Trump and his budget director make a different argument on those issues about DEI or about race-based hiring and their opposition to it. But those measures are very much being seen as part of the overall battle over the shutdown.
And a White House official said this morning that the mass layoffs would begin if talks went nowhere. But NewsNation's Libby Dean just reported just hours later, President Trump says those layoffs are already happening right now. Have you heard anything about this? Have you heard of any agencies that have started firing workers?
I have not. Now, if you have reporting that is different from that, by all means tell me. I have not heard of layoffs happening yet. But there is an impasse, obviously, in the shutdown. There may be talks, but there isn't a lot of evidence that either side is backing down from its existing position. So here in Washington, the expectation is not that the shutdown will end anytime soon. I think we're looking at a minimum of several days before we see the log jam break in that regard.
And we do see a new poll showing just who Americans are blaming for the ongoing shutdown. Republicans taking slightly more of the blame. A third of Americans say that it belongs on all sides. I mean, do you see a tipping point that could skew those numbers more sharply to one side or the other?
Well, you just mentioned the possibility of layoffs. That will be a key moment if and when it happens. Because the question is, do people in those circumstances blame Republicans, who, after all, have both chambers of Congress as well as the White House in their control, or do they see Democrats as having confected a crisis which has ultimately led to government workers losing their jobs? Also, I would say briefly, Natasha, if you have widespread layoffs, well, then you're in a sense taking money out of the economy. This is money that people would have earned that they wouldn't otherwise, that they won't be earning that they otherwise would have earned. So will there be even mild economic effects on that? We will see how that plays into it all.
And meanwhile, we see the White House and Republicans laying the blame squarely at the feet of Democrats. Do you find that fair? Is there any more nuance than that?
There's not a whole lot of more nuance. I think it really depends on what lens voters use to look at this shutdown. One is Democrats are trying to leverage the shutdown for policy changes, specifically on health care And will voters blame those Democrats for not simply allowing the government to stay open while those negotiations take place? The converse argument, which I've just mentioned, is the idea that if Republicans hold the White House, the Senate, and the House, it's ultimately on them. And if government ceases for a long time and there is suffering caused by that, is it the GOP that gets the blame?
Niall Stanage, appreciate the context, the analysis, the time as always. Thank you so much.
Thank you for watching. Subscribe below and download our NewsNation app right now on your phone, and you will get fact-based, unbiased news for all Americans.